Good afternoon. We're calling the Ordinance Committee meeting to order. We'd first like to do roll call.
Councilmember Snedden.
Here.
Councilmember Rouse. Councilmember Murillo.
Here.
Thank you. And now we'd like to hear the staff report. If Madam Clerk would please read the item for consideration.
Draft ordinance restricting the use of expanded polystyrene within the city of Santa Barbara.
Thank you. And now we'd like to invite the staff report. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Thank you. I'm Renee Irely from the Environmental Services Division, Finance Department, and I'm also here today with Jill Murray and George Johnson from the Creeks Division. And we'll be going over the ordinance and some possible elements to include in that today. As you might recall, back in November, we brought forward the topic. I am going to go briefly through some background just to make sure we're all still on the same page, and then spend the majority of the time talking about possible ordinance elements and the stakeholder inclusion for direction. So really quickly, expanded polystyrene is a material made from petrochemicals that becomes moldable when heated, and two common forms end up being made into cups, clamshells, plates, coolers, etc. And styrofoam is the major brand name to which it's commonly referred. A little over 10 years ago, EPS was identified as a concern for several reasons, primarily due to litter. And the primary objectives for EPS regulation generally are to reduce foam as urban litter, reduce foam that reaches waterways and the ocean, and reduce the use of a material that cannot be readily composted or recycled. And certainly, I think we all agree, while it's preferable to have a statewide solution, there have been 6 attempts so far in the last 10 years, and all of them so far have failed at the state level. So currently, I believe 114 cities in the state have now adopted local ordinances. And while a small percentage of it is litter, EPS foam can have widespread impacts. So much so that the state and regional water boards have recognized this and are regulating trash as a pollutant in all existing or new stormwater permits. It's light, it breaks apart, it's hard to collect. As litter, it accumulates in landscaping and it's an eyesore. Birds, fish, and wildlife mistake it for food and ingest it. Statewide, local trash assessments are estimating that 3 to 9% of litter is EPS by volume, and Caltrans most recently estimated that EPS makes up to 15% of the litter that they're finding on the highway and in street litter. 80% of ocean litter comes from land, and of that, 60% is plastic. EPS is a non-biodegradable in nature, and it makes up the 4th most observed plastic in the ocean. It also has toxicity impacts. Styrene is a possible human carcinogen, and it's a known lab animal carcinogen. Its production exposes workers and the atmosphere to chemical byproducts during production. And the same chemicals may leach into food later served from EPS food containers. Obviously, we hear quite a bit of stories in the news about birds and marine wildlife that ingest EPS foam. The National Academy of Sciences estimates that by 2050, 99% of seabirds will have EPS and other plastics in their digestive systems. And that can cause mechanical blockages and then also chemical poisoning. So, around the state, local programs are showing a direct correlation between an EPS ordinance and the reduction in EPS foam litter. Over the last 10 years, numerous outlets for paper or plastic alternatives have developed, including the two largest container producers in the country now make alternatives to EPS foam. And while an EPS ordinance is effective in significantly reducing EPS foam litter and its impacts, it doesn't reduce the use of single-use containers. So this policy still ends up basically with a one-to-one replacement for single-use. So our current solid waste processing system, it's in the midst of a transition. So in the short term, the switch's primary benefits really are in reducing litter and enhancing marine health. But this supports our overall moving towards more composting and using less harmful materials. So luckily, our community has a good voluntary conversion to alternative products. Although I think we are about 70% of restaurants that are voluntarily using alternatives, and we've likely hit a threshold where more probably won't convert without some sort of incentive. So in moving forward with ordinance development, key elements that need to be defined include sort of the scope of the regulated activities, the implementation timeline and phase in of different potentially subsectors of those affected, and then any exemptions. I think fortunately locally we have a couple of really good examples of ordinances and their language, including Carpinteria, Santa Monica, and Long Beach. So in looking at regulated activities, most of the local ordinances around the state are addressing sort of three sub-areas of EPS foam containers. Sort of what we're classifying as takeout containers, mainly clamshells and cups primarily. And based on our survey of restaurants here in Santa Barbara, about 84% of the EPS foam used in restaurants are of these two types. The remainder of containers used at restaurants in Santa Barbara are the eat-in containers, plates, bowls, primarily. And then there's the retail sale of EPS containers. Again, many jurisdictions either included a phase-in of eliminating the retail sale of the above types of containers, or they're updating their ordinances to include them. Carpinteria just in the last couple of months revised their ordinance to cover retailers. And by this I mean grocery and drug stores, liquor stores, hardware stores, things of this nature. Another piece of the ordinance for consideration is exemptions. So again, typical exemptions from an ordinance is for prepackaged food. This is food that is made and wrapped outside of the city, then brought in and sold without ever being taken out and repackaged. That's generally due to an interstate commerce law. Although I do understand that Carpinteria is taking a look at whether they have the ability to regulate that as well. The second area that is often exempted is containment of raw meat, fish, and eggs. EPS foam is effective in holding the liquids associated with those types of raw food. I do know of several instances of other communities that are using or recommending in their ordinances language in the use of compostable trays instead of foam. And then there are styrofoam elements that really have little likelihood of ending up as litter or in the marine environment. Those are items that are completely encapsulated. An example is the ice chests that are made of foam, but they're in rigid plastic, and so there's no way to access the foam itself. So it makes them light, but they're durable and they can't break apart. There's certain construction products that are also built similarly. And then mail packaging is another option that can still be exempted. The third element around regulated activities is whether to include language that would be explicit about what alternatives need to be used instead. This is fairly typical across other jurisdictions. Again, using Carpinteria as an example, they do explicitly call out the use of biodegradable, compostable, or recyclable materials as acceptable alternatives. Biodegradable meaning compostable, or that it can be broken down from a more complex to a more simple form via bacteria. Compostable is all materials in the product will break down or otherwise become part of usable compost and in a composting program. And then recyclable, which is materials that are part of the solid waste stream, which can be recycled consistent with, in this case, our program that we currently run. In terms of implementation, other cities certainly vary the amount of time allowed to transition into ordinance requirements. And this can either be set by the type of business that we would like to address and or subsets of those businesses. So for example, looking at smaller restaurants versus some of the more established ones, restaurants that might serve more difficult types of food to carry, retail versus restaurants, because restaurants, I think, generally are more attuned to the topic as opposed to retailers. So those sorts of variances we could take a look at. And then certainly also kind of given where we as a community sit right now, we just might want to be mindful of what the implementation timeline looks like, just given that we've gone through the last couple of disasters, although in looking at the timeline for an ordinance, were we to come back with draft language in the next 2 to 3 months and then gave some kind of lead time, it could be very late into 2018, early 2019 before we're implementing. And then finally, it is common to include an exemption process for those affected by the ordinance. I think it's a good element to include. It can be a very simple sort of application process where the business states the case about why they have some sort of financial hardship or a unique situation where they need more time to be able to come into compliance. We can set that up so that it's an annual application process. It's reviewed by the director of finance. It's signed off on, and then there's a means to provide some relief to those who need it. So as obviously any ordinance would impact a significant number of businesses, we'd want to continue to engage the interested members on the discussion of the language and its impacts and getting input on the timeline. Our team has been working with businesses out in the community already and is really built for this type of outreach. We have a very robust recycling coordinator program, and we have intimate relationships with the business customers already through our recycling and food waste programming. We already do in-house training with both their staff and managers on a regular basis at all of the restaurants. I feel like generally we have a very good relationship and have a good feel for what works in terms of communicating the needs of new programs and programming changes. So certainly that would continue, like meeting one-on-one with the businesses, continuing to do alternative product research and sharing that information. I'll go into more detail on that in a minute. And then providing different means of getting input from the community as we move along. And certainly concerns tend to be focused on the costs of the alternatives and the ability to retain temperature and food quality of any kind of product that they're developing. So I said in terms of meeting with businesses, we have already identified several restaurants who have shared their stories with us around the transitions itself that they've made, and challenges or things that they had perceived as challenges and ended up not being with us to help focus our ongoing outreach to new businesses. And we have been speaking with restaurants who have establishments in both Carpinteria and here in Santa Barbara. So getting their perspective on how it worked for them when they were in Carpinteria and suggestions on how we might be rolling out our program here in Santa Barbara. So we will continue to work with that, work with them, and to, in particular, I think, focus on our small, locally owned restaurants. They're really the ones who need the most information and a sharing of options for them, and tend to have unique concerns. Again, as I said, we using our recycling coordinator program, and then focusing on the costs, the ordinance, and what kind of ongoing assistance we'll be able to provide to them. So we have been speaking with the distributors of the alternatives and also the early converters to gather more information that would be useful for ordinance implementation. Ideally, our plan is to not just provide one-on-one input to the restaurants, but also to enlist several of these early adopters to provide actually like business-to-business support as well. So it is not necessarily coming from the city, but from someone who's had experience in converting to use the alternatives, and to develop some workshops both with them and the distributors to provide some hands-on information about the alternatives and how they perform and the easiest ways to get them. And this slide is showing some information on the product research around the cost differentials. There, as you can see, generally, the costs of the alternatives are comparable now as compared to where they were even several years ago. So especially with cups, there really is no difference in the cost between the two. The same with the clamshells, with the hinge containers. There is obviously a bit of a difference. We have heard from restaurants who have converted to these that they tend to pass through those costs directly in terms of adjusting their prices. And so it tends to end up being overall cost neutral, but in terms of like an upfront cost, it can be a bit of a hindrance. And then, as I said, we'll be doing several stakeholder and public surveys. We've had a lot of success with using those in the past in terms of getting feedback and energizing certain subpopulations in the community. And there's a list of some of the key affected groups that we've already started working with. And so then regarding next steps, obviously we would take the report today. We'd like to go through the options as we started to lay them out here for you and get feedback from the committee on items to develop further and hopefully put together some draft language and get some more feedback from the community and bring that back to you. And with that, I'd be happy to take any questions.
Thank you. I'd like to invite public comment at this time. Penny Owens, you're here.
And it's live. Good afternoon, Ordinance Committee. Penny Owens with Santa Barbara Channel Keeper. We're so pleased that the city of Santa Barbara is joining the growing list of now 114 cities in California taking action to reduce foam pollution. And as you heard from Renee, the city of Carpet was on November 13th. They unanimously voted to update their foam ordinance to include a ban on the retail sale of foam products like plates, cups, and coolers that all too often were still ending up as litter in the parks like Carpinteria State Beach, making their way to the creeks and beaches, and eventually the ocean. Channel Keeper has the following recommendation for Santa Barbara's foam ordinance. As presented in the report, we would like to see a ban on the retail sale of disposable foam items included, as many other coastal cities in California are also including in their foam ordinances. And we'd also like to include an additional polystyrene regulation that to provide plastic cutlery. So that's like to-go forks and spoons and knives and condiments and chopsticks on demand. And so this is a similar provision that was included in Culver City's recently adopted foam ordinance. And they just adopted that ordinance, I believe, back in November 2017. So as we mentioned in our past comments, Channel Keeper is conducting outreach and education in the community about plastic litter and its impacts when we're out at events, and we'd be happy to continue with this and assisting with education efforts ahead of a local ban. In fact, on the outreach front, we recently reached out to a local taco hotspot that I mentioned a letter of support for the foam ban at the last council meeting, Moni's Tacos, and asked them if they would participate in a stakeholder meeting with similar restaurants, so like the smaller mom and pop Mexican takeout restaurants, just to share the information about alternatives, costs, and their experience as they went foam free. And we talked with them about this in the past, and they were willing and happy to do so. And you'll also hear from my colleague at CEC about some of our outreach. We've been in touch with blenders, which is you'll probably discuss a little bit as well. So Channel Keeper looks forward to finding less foam pollution during our regular creek and beach cleanups in the future. Thanks for your work on this.
Thank you. And next we'd like to hear from Kathy King.
Thank you, Chair Snedden and members of the Ordinance Committee. My name is Kathy King. I'm the Director of Outreach and Education at the Community Environmental Council. CEC first approached the city about 10 years ago on this issue, so we are very grateful that it's being considered at this time. We support all of the staff recommendations and would also, in addition to Channel Keeper, respectfully suggest adding a clause that requires that food providers ask customers if they want plastic cutlery, chopsticks, condiments, and those types of things that tend to be thrown in bags and handfuls and then end up in all of our drawers in our offices and at home, because a lot of times we have those items at home already and we don't need them. I think that could save money for these businesses and also prevent litter. Single-use plastic accounts for half of all manufactured plastic, and estimates are that there will be more plastic than fish in our oceans by 2050. We must do our part to reduce single-use plastic at the source. It took more than 200 local plastic bag laws, of which City of Santa Barbara was one, to push the state to take action. And Californians Against Waste is estimating that the same type of momentum will be needed on EPS, so we can contribute to that movement of getting the state to take action on this ultimately, hopefully, not too distant future. CEC is also available to continue assisting the city in outreach and education efforts going forward. Thank you so much.
I have a question, Madam Chair. Thanks. So, Ms. Irely, the retail items then are coolers, like somebody's going to the beach and, oh, we need a cooler, or plates and styrofoam cups, right? That's what you mean, like if they go to the market and get styrofoam or polystyrene items.
Thank you, Mayor Murillo. Yes, that's what I mean, is that the retail sale of those types of items, cups, plates, coolers primarily. Yeah.
Okay. And so with the single-use plastic bag ban, so we had a program where the retailer could charge 10 cents for the bag, and that was kind of part of the whole program. So is that one of the ideas here, is that we would recommend an amount, or would we just leave that up to the restaurant or eatery to tack on the charge?
At the moment, we had not contemplated that there would be a set charge associated with those. If you would like us to look into that, we'd certainly be willing and obviously happy to do so. That had been a popular idea, I think, with EPS management, along with single-use bag bans several years ago, and ended up moving forward with the bags, not so much at the local level for EPS containers. So we would be breaking new ground in some ways in doing that, but we can certainly do more research on that if you'd like.
Do we know, or do the CEC know what or Channel Keeper, how Carpinteria handles that? Do they let people?
The ordinance is silent on that, so any pass-through would be up to the individual business.
Okay. And then this idea of, were they saying on-demand plastic fork? Sometimes they ask me if I get takeout. They'll say, do you need forks and knives? And usually no, because I'm going home. But so have you heard of that idea? This is the first I'm hearing of it.
So thank you, Mary. Yes, we have heard of that idea, and we support it. I think it's a good and easy way to do outreach to businesses, just to where increase their awareness that making that ask could significantly reduce the amount of plastic utensils and straws, for that matter, that they are handing out and that aren't necessarily used.
Thank you. That's it.
Councilmember Routh.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Somebody that's conspicuously absent today is a Blenders representative. And I'm kind of curious. I know that since I've gone into their stores since our last meeting, they have a sign kind of explaining their whole container thing in their shops. And I just think of a local company that's probably got the biggest impact in this situation. Where are we with them? Is there any progress with that situation?
Thank you, Committee Mayor Rouse. We are, and along with actually CEC and Channel Keeper, are continuing to work with Blenders. We recognize that they, I think, have a unique situation in terms of the product that they are offering and some of the expectations from their customers. And they have recently returned to using the EPS foam cups for their product. However, they are also, they increased the discount for the use of a reusable mug to try to encourage people to invest in that, as opposed to using the single-use cups as well. So we will continue to work with them. I'm certainly interested in potentially having some sort of pilot, whatever that might be, to be determined to help them in their transition. And certainly in terms of having an exemption process, we would have that ability to look at them and put them potentially on a different time frame if we needed to help them convert.
Well, I could see an exemption in terms of a time frame, but it'd be kind of hard to go forward with the overall city ban on EPS with one of our homegrown companies who's a very visible and very active company in the community. So I'm going to need to hear more about that. In terms of the bring your own container thing, I know that if environmental health were here or our insurance agents were here, they'd both have something to say about that. And there's a very good reason why takeout food is normally done in sterile provided containers as opposed to bring your own. So I don't think that's really, I mean, maybe it works for Starbucks and maybe it works in Blender's case, although it's a risky practice. It very much is. So you don't know exactly what's going on with that. So I don't know how practical that is. In terms of the on-demand silverware and whatnot, I mean, I would imagine the most, because there is an expense to that, most people ask in advance whether or not you want the chopsticks, bags of soy sauce, blah, blah, blah. Certainly we could suggest that. I have a hard time weaving that into the ordinance and making it one of the hammers where we're going with this. When we spoke about this in Sustainability Committee, there was also a recommendation, actually I know because I made the recommendation, that staff do, and I think you had this mentioned on slide 15 about alternative product research and information sharing, and I was going to suggest rather than spending a zillion hours of staff time doing it, there are 4 or 5 purveyors that service this town with those containers would probably be happy as pie to provide all the information, all the products, all the availability, and all the pricing that any of us who use these people would need. So I would think that, we could accomplish this, and I think it is a good thing to accomplish relatively quickly. I'm obviously still irritated that the state has wimped out on this again like they did with plastic bags, and here we are as individual agencies looking at it. But I still, because of their high-profile nature and the volume that they put out, I still think we have to have a blender's answer before we go too much further, something definitive. And I don't know what that would be, but like I say, it's just going to look silly to ban everybody else from using EPS and having blenders do it with impunity. So,
well, we will bring something back more definitive, in particular with regard to blenders. I mean, part of it is in some ways like timing, as I was talking about in our system itself, where we are in terms of being able to process certain alternative cups, because ideally I think they would prefer to go to the compostable cups, and we don't have a good venue for those right now unless they are disposed of in the store itself. But as I said, we will work with them, and we will bring back
well, even if they did provide an incentive, like you said, about bringing your own cup in, a reusable cup, I still am going to think that that's going to be a relatively small percentage of their clientele. Most people, there's a Blenders, let's go have one of these. So it's going to be important, I think, from a visibility standpoint, a consistency standpoint, what we do. And I want to work with them because they are a homegrown, successful local business, and I want them to thrive, but it's got to make sense for everybody.
Understood.
Thank you for your presentation. I have a few questions and some comments also. One question I have is, if you don't require acceptable alternatives, what would people use instead? I mean, what is something out there that doesn't fall on that list that you gave of acceptable?
That's a good question. Thank you, Madam Chair. And in reality, it would be one of the other alternatives for the most part. However, some ordinances just choose to be silent as opposed to being more explicit. There are some local ordinances where they've said, well, we don't want to promote single-use plastic, so we will only promote the paper type products, for example. So that's where they tend to get more restrictive. And that's why I brought it up as an element just for consideration.
So we would have the option of either just restricting or being specific about what the alternatives could be. And then if something new comes along that is exciting and a good alternative, we would have to update the ordinance if we restricted
Yes,
some new
potentially.
compostable
Yes, ma'am.
material or some new something. Then we'd update. So we could just restrict the use and not have a
Not have the
detailed
list of what the acceptable,
Okay.
acceptable alternatives. That's right.
Another question I have is, aside from cost, because they seem to be comparable, what are reasons that businesses give for why they don't want to transition? Like what would be the downside other than a blender situation where it's keeping the beverage cool, but in the clamshells, or what are some of the reasons they give?
Yeah, thank you. That's primary the reason. Sometimes the concern for the product itself and how well it's transferred. So whether it's something that is very cold or very hot, and there's concern about the temperature loss and then the degradation of the product, and then in certain instances, depending on the product and the ability just for kind of its sloppiness and its soakability, and whether, for example, is a paper product comparable to a plastic or an EPS clamshell in containing that.
And then I have a couple comments, I guess, about, since we're mentioning blenders, even though they're not here to discuss, but I did just go recently when they were using the compostable, I guess, and not the styrofoam, and the drinks stayed perfectly cool and delicious. And if they sold, say, cozies that are small, and could go on the cup, that could keep it cool for longer and be another product to sell other than the big, bulky, reusable. And then just another comment about the bringing your own. At City College, they have the clamshell. You have the option of owning your own clamshell container, and it works really well. I mean, going to the cafeteria, using it, and they're clean and safe enough, I think, as an alternative. Just putting that out there. I don't know that they keep
You've
anything.
never met my health inspector, obviously.
Yeah. And then I just want to agree with your timing of implementation, that we want to be especially sensitive to not overly burdening businesses right now, but maybe having a timeline within the year, I think, is reasonable.
Ed, I'm sorry, I had one follow-up question, Madam Chair, if I may. Going back to the numbers and whatnot, we obviously just have some anecdotal numbers right now about the number of facilities out there, particularly, I think we're talking mostly about restaurants. And do we have any firm handle on the numbers? I have to think that in this day, it is hard to replace foam in terms of, in terms of the ability to hold temperature and to not leak and do all the things that they do. But those alternative packagings have become competitive price-wise. They're getting a little bit better. So certainly, and most customers will browbeat you into using them as opposed to using the foam anyway right now. And I've experienced that myself. So we don't do that anymore. But do we have any idea what the numbers are like in terms of the outreach from staff and how many people are still involved in the EPS use of, outside of the blender thing, obviously?
Let me do some quick math here. I would say we have probably close to about 80 restaurants that are still not using the EPS. So in terms of concentrated outreach, it's a very reasonable number for our team to work with. So.
Yeah, that seems doable, and I think we can do it in a way that also impacts them the least, which I think all of us share that same desire not to burden a small business, especially right now.
Yeah, absolutely. So,
Madam Mayor.
Thank you. So do we have options? So either you're going to go out and do public outreach, or do you want us to take a vote on, because I'm ready to go for this, exactly what's on the screen. So, and to recommend it, because if I'm remembering correctly, the city council, when we looked at it, the instruction was that we wanted to go forward with a a prohibition on EPS and styrofoam because it was bad for the environment, and we would work with the businesses and give them a good long lead time. I acknowledge that is aside from the natural disasters and the restaurants are dealing with an increase in the minimum wage, so we need to give them a break. I'm good with longer than 6 months as well. Give them a good long time to get rid of the inventory that they have and get used to something new. So I would move that we go ahead and adopt this, and then when you do your outreach or recommend this to the city council, right? So when you do your outreach, you have something to tell them that we're getting ready to make this the regulation in the city.
Okay. Thank you, Madam Mayor. So just to be clear, you would like to include both retail and the restaurants in the draft itself?
I would.
Okay. I did.
Councilmember Rouse.
You were saying that Carpinteria already has a model ordinance in place with retail as well.
That's correct.
Because I don't know, and have we done much outreach with retail yet, i.e. the 7-Elevens, convenience stores, the people that would sell this kind of thing?
We have not. We've conducted a survey to have a better understanding of the products that they have in place, but we've not engaged them in any outreach yet.
And Carpinteria, if I'm correct, did this in 2 phases. They had the takeout eating establishments, and then they did retail in a subsequent time?
They did almost 10 years apart, but yes.
Okay. So because I really have no concept of what's out there in the retail world or the impacts, I don't want to do any unintended consequences. I'd like to give staff the opportunity to do that outreach as well, but that's also another bulk of work to do. So I think from my standpoint, Madam Mayor, I take what you're saying to heart, but I also think maybe if we focused on the food establishments first, did that outreach, made a model ordinance around those things, and then, put into our staff direction to research and look at the retail as well, in hopes of sometime folding that in and making a complete ban on the retail sale of EPS. That's an uncontained EPS. How we ever define that, I keep thinking about surfboards. I'm going, oh man, I don't want to do that.
They'd be exempt.
Yeah. But to do it in that phase, that might make it a little bit easier on staff in terms of a workload, and maybe make a quicker timeline, if I'm not mistaken.
That's correct, and we're certainly happy to take that direction. We could also bring back at least some of the draft language and maybe the preliminary outreach to the retailers and look at a different timeline for them as well. So maybe they would have a longer implementation timeline since the restaurants are further along.
So, Madam Chair, I would be ready to make a motion if you... She has a motion on the table. Oh, you do? What was your motion?
But it didn't get a second, I don't think.
I
So
would second it.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
It got a second. So, Councilmember Rouse, just in response to, and out of due respect to what you were saying, we could include in this recommendation a nice long lead time for education, and if we wanted to stagger the retail later after there's been some outreach, that would be, I think that's reasonable.
May I ask you this then? Are we talking about targeting the takeout or targeting the food facilities with the idea that we're also going to be doing the research on the retail so that you could implement a 2-phased ordinance, or you want to do it all at once? Because I don't know if we have all the information for the retail establishments yet, but you do seem like you have pretty tight information on the dining establishments.
That's correct. And as I said, we have good information about the types and the amounts that are being sold in Santa Barbara. It is working with some of the retailers on what would that timeline be for them to be able to deplete their existing inventory and bring in the alternatives.
And just because when we had this item before, I think we did focus in terms of the public on eating establishments. So I don't know if the retailers would have had input, or if they would have been here saying, well, you can't do that for
That's
these
correct.
reasons. I wouldn't mind hearing that before we move forward on a direction.
I think for planning, it sends a stronger message that we do not support styrofoam in regardless of what the outlet is, and that we can be sensitive in outreach to the timing or how that affects particular businesses. But I think if we're allowing takeout to have styrofoam use and retail not to, and different for different places, then is a place a retail place, a takeout place, I think it's not as clear, and I actually think it makes more work to have to do the ordinance in two phases, whereas we could just say we do not support it, and these might be the different timelines after outreach to see how it impacts businesses.
Point taken. I just think it's going to delay the whole process to include retail at this point when we don't have the information. And I'm thinking about staff time and work and the amount of time and work staff's already put in. So that's kind of my point. That's why I think we could probably do the eating establishments first,
Madam Chair.
with the idea that we're going to include retail eventually.
Madam Mayor?
Thanks. So, Mr. Rouse, I'm thinking that, so we would give a long time, an appropriate time for the retailers to deplete their inventory, and then they would just start selling something else that people would buy, in, you know, a different kind of plate and a different kind of cup, and it would be solved. I think the public is supportive of protecting the marine environment, and they want to do the right thing and buy the right product, and we're helping them make that choice.
I agree with that. I just think about retailers like 7-Eleven, like CVS, like Rite Aid, that have these products on their shelves that they don't make decisions on necessarily. Certainly, they'd have to comply with a local ordinance eventually, but they may have a trailer full of these things that they got in from Iowa, so I don't know. And what I say, without that information, I'm reticent to go forward on retail.
Are those examples of retail? Is it mainly large chains who might be able to absorb the costs outside of our city by retailing somewhere else? Is that something we know?
Yes, Madam Chair. Those are actually both examples. I mean, we will have chains who potentially have different levels of inventory and maybe alternative ways to reassess those. I can't speak to that right now. And then we have the local stores who have more direct control of their inventory.
Madam Mayor?
Thank you. So if we vote on this today and we go with this recommendation and we get the ball rolling, does it go to City Council? How soon would it need to go to City Council for full approval from Council?
So, thank you, Madam Mayor. So yes, eventually it would need to go to the ordinance. To City Council. We could bring something back to you in the interim. So we could come back in 60 days or something and take another look at the draft and what we've been able to do with the retailers and get more of their input and before moving forward with it.
And by that time, they would know about it, and
Yeah.
we might see some of them in the audience as well.
Absolutely, yes.
It looks like Mr. Rouse is comfortable with that. So coming back to the Ordinance Committee. Okay.
Councilmember Rouse?
Yeah, I'd be in favor of this if all the options came back as a draft ordinance to Ordinance Committee first, which I think is the proper protocol anyway. And then we could refine it, send it on to council. And like you said, Ms. Maria, we could then perhaps have the retail input that I'm looking for anyway.
Okay.
And I would like to also direct staff to reach out to those, the larger non-independents that we don't talk to that often to just make sure that we know what we're doing.
Is that a clear and doable direction?
Yes, Madam Chair. Thank you. Yes.
Are we ready to take a vote? Okay.
Thank you.
Madam Clerk, would you do a roll call vote?
Councilmember Rouse? Chair Sneddon?
Aye.
Mayor Murillo?
Aye.
Passed unanimously. Thank you.
Madam Chair, what we didn't talk about, though, was the on-demand fork part of it, because that wasn't part of what was in the staff report.
Do we have a motion to discuss that now or to actually?
I move that when staff is doing their outreach, they ask about that as well. Include that in the. I move that we include that in the draft ordinance and the outreach. They're out there talking to people now, or they will be.
So include it in the actual ordinance or include it in the outreach?
Right, you're writing a draft ordinance, I think. Add that, and we can test it and see if people are, or what they say, since you're going to be doing outreach.
Is that going to include condiments, the hot mustard and sweet and sour sauce, or where are we going with it?
Yes.
I just don't want to get in the weeds and these kind of details and lose the big picture. What we're trying to do is get rid of EPS.
Well,
And we're trying to reduce impacts on the landfill and the marine environment. I would suggest, if with the committee's pleasure, that we keep it as simple and straightforward as we can if we want to get something done in a normal period of time.
Okay, Councilmember Rouse, what I'm thinking is it would actually save the restaurant money. If people say, I don't want ketchup and stuff, then that would save them money. Okay, can I make the motion that staff, while they're out there talking to people, that they take their temperature on that and say, what do you think about?
I would second that motion.
Okay.
Then we'll need to vote.
Did you need a motion on
because
that,
we had a
staff?
motion, or is that just?
I believe it's understood. We will make sure we get more information on, yes, the on-demand
Thank you.
items.
Good, thanks.
Meeting is adjourned. Thank you.